This is the second of two daily devotionals for Thursday, May the 26th, 2022. Now, the title of both devotionals today has been The Cycle of Man's Sins and God's Judgments. Now, this second devotional will focus on Ezekiel Chapter 21, which I have titled The Judgment of the Righteous and the Wicked. Now, living in Babylon, but knowing the city of Jerusalem was under siege and thousands would perish was difficult for those in captivity who lived in Babylon. Now, the elders of Israel had asked Ezekiel at the conclusion of chapter 20, doth the Lord not speak parables? Well, the Lord determined in chapter 21 he would answer them with anything that wasn't a parable, but the exact facts themselves. And so notice with me in chapter 21 in verses 2 through 7 how Ezekiel now was to preach against Jerusalem. Now notice verse 2 of Ezekiel 21 that the Lord answered the inquiry of those elder men, saying to Ezekiel, Son of man, set thy face towards Jerusalem, drop thy word towards the holy places, prophesy against the land of Israel. Well, he was no longer going to be speaking in parables, and the message was clear. The prophet was commanded in verse 3 to say to the land of Israel, Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I am against thee, and will draw forth my sword out of its sheath, and will cut off from thee the righteous and the wicked. It's a terrible thing when God has set himself against a nation and a people. Well, the judgment of the Lord was imminent, for he was ready to draw his sword and judge the righteous and the wicked. We read in verses 4 and 5 that all flesh, man, woman, boy, and girl would know it was the Lord that executes judgment. Ezekiel was commanded to sigh, and in so doing indicate the pain and the sorrow the people of Jerusalem would suffer. Now notice in verses 8 through 17, the preparation to face God's judgment. God warned. His sword of judgment was sharpened, and it would be borne by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, the executioner of God's will. The Lord directed Ezekiel to dramatize the sufferings of Jerusalem in verse 12 and saying, Cry and howl, Son of Man. Ezekiel 21 and verse 14 described the swift violence that would come upon Jerusalem, the great slaughter that would befall the people. In verse 15, none would escape, and those who attempted to would be destroyed, for they would be slain. In verse 18 through 27, Babylon was going to be God's agent of judgment. Now that is a great lesson for us and for all nations that know the Lord and then reject him. The Lord had left no doubt he was employing the sword of the king of Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar's army would attack the Ammonites and then lay siege to Jerusalem. And though he had consulted with his idols, the Lord had used the king's superstitious ways to draw him to Jerusalem to do his bidding. And with the mounds laid up against the walls of the city and the battering rams of Babylon at the gates of Jerusalem, the people would remember it was brought upon them because of their sins. They would remember all that had been prophesied. In fact, verses 25 and 26, we're reminded what we've seen in other places of our study of 2 Chronicles 26, 2 Chronicles 25. The Zedekiah, the last king of Israel, Israel's Davidic line, would be stripped of his crown and abased. And in fact, until Christ returns and comes to his throne, whose right it is, for God promised, I will give it to him, to the Lord Jesus Christ. Now I have a closing thought for you. Our study closes with God's assurance that unlike the children of Israel who would return to their land, the judgment against the Ammonites who had harmed Israel would be final. And in verse 32, they would be no more. Remember, there is no Ammonite nation. Now I close with just a simple thought, and it is this: that God uses an adversary, an enemy, to punish a nation that has rebelled against him. There's much in our news today about various threats to our nation, the nation that I live in, the United States. And if you're listening to this from another country, no doubt you're hearing the same news. You see, God uses the Nebuchadnezzars, who are heathens and are leaders of heathen nations, to punish those nations that have turned from him. You and I might not be able to save our nation, but certainly we can be a testimony of God's saving grace. God bless you. I hope this has been an encouragement to you this day, and bye-bye.